Rome did not build its empire on courage alone, it built it on debt. We love to imagine Roman legions as unstoppable warriors, fueled by honor and discipline. But behind every polished helmet and sharpened gladius was a surprisingly complex and expensive logistic system. Thousands of soldiers needed food, weapons, roads, and wages. Horses needed feed. Siege machines required timber and skilled craftsmanship. And all of that meant money. A lot of money. So how did Rome finance centuries of war? Was it only through conquest? And more importantly, why does this still matter today? Because when you look closely at Rome's wars, you realize something. War wasn't fought only in arenas and battlefields. It was embedded in the financial system itself. And once that system was set in motion, it couldn't stop. Expansion wasn't a choice. It was a financial necessity. Sound familiar? Let's go back. In the early Republic, Rome's army was a citizen army. If you owned land, you could be called to fight. Soldiers brought their own weapons and returned home when the war ended. But as the state expanded, wars became longer, farther away, and more destructive. The old system began to break. You couldn't just grab a spear and head to battle anymore. Rome needed professional soldiers. That's when Rome centralized its military economy. The state began paying wages, not much, but enough to buy loyalty. Then came the turning point. Conquest itself became a source of income. Every new city meant more taxes, more slaves, more gold mines, and more tribute. A self-feeding system emerged. War financed more war. But that's where things became dangerous. Rome didn't rely on taxes alone. It leaned heavily on debt. During long and costly wars, especially the Punic Wars against Carthage, the state took massive public loans from wealthy elites. These people were Rome's rising economic class, the equites. These weren't donations, they were investments. And investors expected returns, interest payments, tax collection rights, and commercial privileges in conquered territories. War became a business. And the more profitable it became, the more Rome fought. Sound familiar? Over time, this military economy reshaped everything. Political power shifted to generals who could promise loot. Senators became, in effect, investors in violence. Private contractors managed everything from logistics to tax collection. It was military-industrial capitalism in a toga. But costs kept rising. To pay soldiers and creditors, the state constantly needed more money. And when wars slowed or rebellions drained the treasury, Rome turned to the oldest trick in the book, debasing the currency. Under Emperor Nero, the silver content of the denarius was quietly reduced. And over the next 2 centuries, this continued. What was once a reliable silver coin became a thin disk of metal backed by almost nothing. The result? Inflation, loss of trust. And by the 3rd century, Rome's monetary system was in free fall. Meanwhile, the rich grew even richer. Senators and elites stored their wealth in land, slaves, and foreign assets. The poor, on the other hand, were stuck with worthless money, heavy taxes, and forced military service. This wasn't just a military collapse, it was a monetary one. Now pause and look at today. Massive budget deficits, wars financed by debt, central banks quietly diluting currencies, an economic class that profits from defense contracts and crises, an economy that requires endless growth just to survive. It's not exactly the same, but its DNA is disturbingly familiar. What Rome shows us is this: an economy built on violent expansion eventually hits a wall. There are only so many lands to conquer, so many resources to extract, so many enemies to fight. And when that runs out, the system turns inward. Debts remain, expectations remain, but income stops. That's when the state begins to squeeze its own people. Rome raised taxes, debased its currency, increased control. It distracted the masses with games, while elites fortified their villas. Sound familiar? Today we don't call it tribute, we call it taxation. We call it quantitative easing. We call it monetary policy. But the system is the same. Central banks print money. Governments spend more than they earn. The rich grow wealthier. The poor are crushed by shrinking wages. Wars are still financed by debt. The United States spent over $2 trillion on the war in Afghanistan, much of it borrowed. So, who got the contracts? Who earned the interest? Who paid the bill? You already know the answer, and just like Rome, the system feeds itself. Once debt becomes normal, you don't even need a crisis to print money. You just need to delay collapse. The extraordinary becomes routine, and people pretend everything is fine, until they can't. That's why economic history matters. These aren't old stories, they're warning signs. When we look at Rome, we see a state that gave too much power to private finance, became addicted to expansion, hollowed out its currency, and crushed its own population under unsustainable burdens. Not because it was evil, but because the system had no off switch. Today we live in a different world. Digital, global, driven by capital flows instead of legions. But the game is the same. Money and power move together. War is still profitable. Inflation still punishes the weak. And financial illusions. They work until they don't. So, what can you do? First, see the system. Most people don't. They think inflation is random. Taxes are inevitable. Debt is freedom. Growth can continue forever. The Stoics had one word for this: illusion. You can't fully escape the system, but you can understand it. You can stop running blindly. You can build resilience not just with money, but with your mind. That means learning financial history, not just personal finance. Watching systemic stress, not market hype. Asking, who benefits when I'm confused? Because you were never meant to ask these questions. You weren't supposed to ask how Rome financed its wars, or how modern states do it today. You were supposed to watch the show, the headlines, the distractions, not the mechanisms, not the incentives. But now you know, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Financial education isn't just about budgeting and investing, it's about understanding power, understanding systems, seeing what's happening behind the stage of stability. So the next time you hear about a new war, a new stimulus package, or a new crisis, don't just watch. Follow the money. Who is lending? Who is winning? And in the end, who is paying? Because if history is trying to teach us anything, it's this. Empires don't collapse when enemies breach the gates. They collapse when the math stops working, and when no one is willing to fix it. If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe and like the video. History doesn't just remember, it explains. And I'll show you where to look.